Hello, everyone. Why don't we get going? My name is Bradley Miller, and I have the great pleasure to be Program Chair of Canadian Studies here at UBC Vancouver on the traditional territories of the Musqueam people. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you tonight to the first of the 2022 Brenda and David McLean lectures featuring the great Professor Laura Moss of the Department of English. Now, in addition to those of us here tonight in Green College, we're also being joined by audience members watching online. In fact, watching online from across the country. We will start the lecture in a minute. There are, however, a few things that I wanted to do beforehand. The first is the obligatory masking guideline, which it looks like everyone has already absorbed from the last 2 years. You are required to keep your masks on while we're inside unless you're eating or drinking. The second thing is the reminder that Fred just gave me, which is this is a perfect moment to turn off the ringers on your cell phones, especially since we are streaming and we are recording for lots of people who want to watch later on. Next and happier is the format for tonight. Laura informs me that she's going to lecture for about 50 minutes, and then we've got lots of time after that for questions and answers. So if you're in the room here and you've got a question for the Q&A period, once we start that, stick up your hand. Laura will call on you. We also, however, welcome everyone who is watching online to participate in the Q&A too. So if you are watching online and you'd like to participate, if you've got a question you want to ask or a comment you want to make, you can do so by going to slido.com. That is SLIDO.com, and entering the code 13404. I test drove this technology earlier. It is really very easy to use. So I want to promise everyone, this is not learning some new complex chatting technology, which we've all had too much of in the last couple of years. I will watch the Slido and we'll put your questions to Laura in the Q&A. 13404. Thank you.
I have a slide too.
Oh, great. Okay. And then after the lecture and the Q&A is done, we'll move next door into Graham House for a reception. There's food and drink. And at that point, if you're eating and drinking, you can take your masks off. So that's something to look forward to. And I'm sure we'll have an awful lot to talk about. The next thing I wanted to do is to take a minute and thank some of the many people that have made tonight possible. Please hold your applause till we're done with the list. We don't want anyone to feel more popular than anyone else. First, I want to thank our host tonight at Green College, especially Principal Mark Vesey, who is here, and the academic programming staff, Ellen Gumbach and Heather Muckart. They have been very generous with us. Alan, in particular, has fielded more emails from me in the last few months than any human being should be obligated to do. I also want to thank some of the wonderful people who have worked behind the scenes in the Faculty of Arts, especially Jen Serratos, Brooke Zhang, and Raven Toth. Raven, in fact, made that beautiful poster for the McLean events that you will all have seen. I also want to acknowledge and thank my great colleague and friend, and I guess the position is Program Chair Emeritus of Canadian Studies, Michelle Ducharme, who is over here. Talk about responding to more emails than any human being should feel obligated to do. We also have some former McLean chairs with us tonight, both in person and online. In fact, I can see a bunch of them from my vantage point here. I want to thank them for coming. And in fact, I want to put another Canadian Studies event on your calendar right now, and that's that on March 29th from 4 to 7 p.m., in the Ideas Lounge across the street up at Peter Wall, we will be hosting a party to celebrate belatedly the launch of former McLean Chair John O'Brien's 2020 book, The Bomb in the Wilderness, which deserves a round of applause, even though we said we weren't going to do it. I'll be distributing some promotional material for that, but I know we are all looking forward to celebrating the belated launch of John's book, or belatedly celebrating the launch of John's book, the party for which has been delayed by the pandemic. I also want to acknowledge our current McLean Chair, Professor Manal Matani, who is watching online now. I want to urge everyone here who's interested in Canadian studies to corner Manal at some point or reach out by email and ask her about the fantastic McLean seminar that she's currently running for our Canadian studies students. She is bringing in some of the most important figures in Canadian studies right now to engage with the students in this class. It seems like a fantastic opportunity. And finally, I want to acknowledge and thank Brenda and David McLean for their enormous generosity and commitment to the study of Canada at UBC. They have supported UBC for more than 40 years in a wide variety of ways. And in fact, I just learned that the McLean Chair in Canadian Studies, which they made possible, is close to celebrating its 30th anniversary. So please join me in thanking the McLeans and everyone else who has made it possible for all of us to be here tonight. And that gets me to our events this year and our McLean lecturer, Laura Moss. When Laura and I were talking a few months ago about the format for these events, she had a really inspired idea. In keeping with past practice, she wanted to do a public lecture herself to share some of her own insights. I, of course, was thrilled by that. I'm sure you all are as well. That's why we're all here together tonight. But she also wanted to bring in some other people and some other perspectives into the conversation. And as a result of that idea, when we reconvene here on March 17th, our second event will be a panel discussion. And Laura has recruited a fantastic panel. Warren Carreau, who is a filmmaker, writer, and photographer, will be coming in from Winnipeg for the event, where he is also professor of English at the University of Manitoba. Laura and Warren will be joined by the poet Rita Wong, who is also professor of critical and cultural studies at Emily Carr University. And they will be joined by the poet Stephen Collis, who is also professor of English in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University. I guess the takeaway message is, if you are here with us tonight, if you are interested in the environment and the study of Canada and art and literature, this is an event you do not want to miss. So I want to urge you all to come back for the event again on the 17th. I'll be circulating the streaming links in a couple of days. And the very last thing that I want to do is to introduce the 2019 to 2021 McLean Chair, Professor Laura Moss. Laura is professor of English here at UBC. She has written and taught and supervised dissertations on a huge array of issues in Canadian and world literature. She is the editor or co-editor of 5 books, and she is the recently retired editor of the journal Canadian Literature. She's the author of a list of articles that, frankly, I gave up counting. And she's published on the work of authors ranging from Chinua Achebe to Margaret Atwood to Lawrence Hill to Daphne Marlett to F.R. Scott to Luoli Sayinka to Zadie Smith, among many others. She has written and published important work on art issues ranging from arts policy to public memorials on the downtown east side of Vancouver. And I also wanted to flag that she is currently doing hugely important work in a really extraordinarily demanding period as the Associate Dean students in the Faculty of Arts. So please join me in welcoming Laura Moss. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Bradley. Thank you very much. to you. I want to add you to the list of people we thank for organizing tonight's event and the one on the 17th. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I know how much goes in behind the scenes to get us all here, so I'm really grateful. I want to echo the thanks to Brenda and David McLean for your incredible support, that long-standing, generous support of Canadian studies. Brings me here amongst, right now, looking straight, I can see 5 former Canadian studies, 6, Ken's here, former McLean chairs. It's remarkable the amount of important work that has gone on because of this support of our field and our various fields and disciplines. So thank you, Brenda and David McLean. So before I jump into the lecture proper, I want to situate myself here. I'm a settler scholar who lives and works on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. My academic home is the Department of English Language and Literatures at UBC. The department recently expanded its land acknowledgement to not only recognize what it means to be situated here in this space, but also to realize that acknowledgement is an active dedication to more just and more accountable relations. So saying that, it's important to recognize that we're now on a promontory called Point Grey, in English, on land claimed by the British as a colonial admiralty reserve in the mid-19th century and occupied by the University of British Columbia since 1914. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the environment, land and water, natural resources and resource extraction, and biocolonialism. And I recognize the many ways that what I say here today has been informed, shaped, and challenged by both colonizing violence and decolonial commitment, to echo the New English Land Acknowledgement. So it's with that recognition and acknowledgement of this place and power that I move forward tonight. Over the course of the next 55 minutes, we'll be covering a lot of ground. There's a large community of people thinking about the environment in Canada today. Part of my job here with this public lecture that I take very seriously is to share and amplify some of the scholarly conversations of Canadianist thinkers and critics, as well as artists, writers, and scholars. So I've chosen to provide a big picture overview kind of talk. I've been trying to not think of it as a romp through environmental art and activism. It's kind of a romp. Please feel free, though, to ask me to do a deeper dive in the Q&A if you'd like. I'm happy to go into anything in more depth. I want to just warn you now that part 1 takes about half the lecture. So when I say part 2, I don't want your heart to drop and think, oh my goodness, we have 4 parts left. Just warning you, they're not even. So participants watching online, as Bradley said, are welcome to ask a question. Bradley, the number that you sent out before was 134404? You said 13404. So there are 2 4s? Yeah. Awesome. So this is the one to use, and that will work, right? And he will convey the questions to me, and I will eloquently answer them. That's the plan. Okay. So points of departure, givens. We are in a climate crisis. I'm not debating whether or not we're in a climate emergency. This is, as I say, a given. This week, the UN Secretary General launched a scathing attack on the climate action lethargy, he called it, of global leaders in light of the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC report. Antonio Guterres called the report, quote, an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. And he argued that there is no time to waste if we want to prevent global temperatures from rising by more than 1.5 degrees. Guterres also pointed out that almost half of humanity is now living in a danger zone. I'll be going back to this inequitable distribution of impact in a few minutes, but it's a starting point, not a point I'm coming to. This is urgent. Another given for me is that old growth forest should be protected. Similarly, I'm concerned about the environmental impact of extraction and transportation of oil. I understand the complexities of living in a resource-based economy where we rely on wood and energy, but I also recognize the urgency of issues we face and the need for sustainability. Number 4, writers and artists have long been commentators on society, pointing to social ills, challenging orthodoxies, reflecting on injustice, the limits of knowledge, understanding, imagination, and compassion. And by long here, I mean millennia across cultures and contexts. So I draw on a long history of considering the role of art in social movements tonight, and looking to artists, writers, and scholars for creative leadership and valuable critique. For now, when I say art, I mean mainly verbal and visual. There's a lot of important work being done on sound, performance, improvisation, film, music, but it's beyond my scope. 5, Canadian culture is a dynamic space for resistance and reconstruction. By training, I'm a post-colonial studies person, theorist, where the simplest definition of post-colonial studies is the continuing process of resistance and reconstruction. Resistance to colonial systems and infrastructures, as well as to cultural hegemonies. Reconstruction is sometimes painful and sometimes gleeful, pushing forward. I agree with the critic Cheryl Loosley, eco-critic, that environmental discourse has a lot to gain from thinking with post-colonial approaches: ambivalence, resistance, and reconstruction. Those are core terms. And even while I'm focusing on West Coast Canadian artists and writers here this evening, climate change is obviously not limited to any one region or any one national context. Indeed, it's unequivocally global in scope. However, even as we talk about the interconnectedness of humans in a planetary context, it is still necessary to locate national cultures in the framework of a history of laws, practices, and preferences that have governed land use, resource allocation, environmental protection, and the resettlement of many people in the name of the nation. And it's important to consider the ways communities have responded in support or in opposition, however community is imagined. Creative activism takes many forms. It happens individually and in collectives. It spans words and images to creative uses of natural materials, to blockades and protests. And it draws on many emotions: hope, but also anger, fear, compassion, generosity, power, love. And beyond feeling, it relies on intellect, knowledge, ideas, imagination. Activism, for some, is about a gentle coming to knowledge, a meditation. For instance, I think of the author Ruth Ezeki, who's written really powerful and important fiction about the dangers of factory farming, about genetic modifications in agriculture, about the Pacific garbage gyre. Ezeki says that in her novel, A Tale for the Time Being, she would be really happy if the book conveys the ways in which we and the world are intimately interconnected in time and space. And I would be overjoyed, she says, if readers felt an appreciation of the earth itself and resolved to treat it more kindly. So the knowledge of interconnection here leads to kindness. There's a power in this version of kindness, I think. But activism, for others, is more overt. It's more embedded explicitly in their artistic practice, and it's often embedded in physical action. Land defender and poet Rita Wong, for instance, was engaged in peaceful protest in 2018 at Trans Mountain's West Ridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby, where she was protesting the expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline. She was arrested at the protest and she was sentenced to 28 days in jail. So in her notes on sentencing, she explains, "Our actions were motivated by necessity due to climate crisis. Since the federal government has abdicated its responsibility to protect us despite full knowledge of this emergency, it became necessary to act." So tonight, I want to consider a range of ways that arts have acted creatively in response to the changing environment and the climate crisis. So our task, I think, is to attend to thinkers, artists, and writers who are formulating a cultural politics out of the environment's disruptive power. Listen to the cracks is how I think of it. Instead of imagining the sublime, picturesque, or beautiful forms of nature, as we saw in late 19th and early 20th century literature and art, and I'm really indebted here to Susan Glickman's work on this subject as a background. Today, I think it's much more common to see active articulations of nature in an altered state of environmental degradation. But how did we get there? What used to be called nature, and is now called the environment, have long been central to Canadian art and letters, shifting shapes with each generation. Resistance, though, to Canadian art has taken many forms, from decolonizing imperatives of things like Kent Monkman's Iron Horse, taking the image we saw before, or that genre of image, and repopulating the landscape with a satirical reimagining of the space, that brings us to the present, where we have someone like Andreas Rutkauskas, who, after the fire, repopulates the landscape, but in the devastation of the burnt-out land that was already there. I love that triptych. 1, 2, 3. I also think about artists like Jin Mayun, with her series from the 90s, Souvenirs of the Self, and also Group of 67, where she was reworking and rewriting canonical Canadian pieces of art, like those of the Group of 7. And I think about where we are now with a photograph I took with one of my sons popping up in the foreground. I do not pretend this is art, but I like it anyway. And it's about the overcrowding of that same scene, with the person standing out so precariously on that log to get herself in the image of the backdrop. There was a lineup of people waiting to go out onto the log to be seen individually with the mountain behind. And that was just such a remarkable scene to me. I really think of that as one of the moments I realized what overcrowding and overpopulation was doing so much and so strongly. So art that draws attention to environmental destruction is part of this resistant trajectory that I've been thinking about. Kent Monkman, Jin Mayun, and artists like the photographer who works on the landscapes after the fire. Looking through a lens of climate change, we see landscapes devastated or repopulated in this new sphere. So, whoops. My scarf or my hair. Okay. How's that? We'll try it. Okay, just as many artists have looked back before looking forward, I want to turn to two moments in Canadian literary history to situate my remarks here. So I turn to 1936 and 1979. In 1936, a landmark collection of modernist poetry called New Provinces was published. Collated and edited by A.J.M. Smith and F.R. Scott, it included the work of young, avowedly modernists in the Make It New school of poets. What it didn't include was the original preface that had been written by Smith. The publisher, McLean, rejected it as too incendiary. So, what was so fiery that it couldn't be published in 1936? Well, it was nothing short of Smith's evisceration of the state of poetry in Canada. He wrote, referring to the previous generation of poets, he said, "The bulk of Canadian verse is romantic in conception and conventional in form." I think he actually spit it when he wrote it. Its two great themes are nature and love. Nature humanized, endowed with feeling, and made sentimental. Love idealized, sanctified, and inflated. He continued with what I think is one of my very favorite lines in all of Canadian letters. The most popular experience is to be pained, hurt, stabbed, or seared by beauty, preferably by the yellow flame of a crocus in the spring or the red flame of a maple leaf in autumn. Ouch. That does hurt. That said, though, although Smith and the modernists rejected the sentimentalized and romanticized depictions of nature, they still themselves often turn to it as the subject of poetry, whether elegizing the lonely land or documenting the history of rock in the Laurentian Shield. The modernist poets had corollaries, artistically, in artists like Tom Thomson, who's on the top, or Lauren Harris here with North Shore Lake Superior. While respecting the land, such poetic and artistic engagements with nature largely took the environment for granted, admiring its strength, coveting its solitude, or using it metonymically to stand in for the nation. They also tended to empty it of human inhabitants and history. Over the past 80 years, nature poets in Canada have definitely repopulated the landscape, right? So have artists like Ken Monkman, Jin Mayun, and so many others. So a lot has changed since the rejected preface, but I begin with this story because it reminds me, as a literary historian, of how contested nature has long been at the center of Canadian poetics, how every generation kicks against the one before, and how conversations we are having today about the efficacy of art have precedence. The second moment that I want to point to aptly illustrates how concern about the environment and climate change isn't new. P.K. Page's 1979 story, Unless the Eye Catch Fire, is one of the finest examples I know about what might happen if the world were to warm to the state where human and animal life could no longer survive. In this story, we follow the final days of a woman and her dog as the temperature outside rises and the community around them closes. They are locked down in their home with supplies rationed, government communication limited, and movement outside curtailed, in a state of full-scale emergency. They slowly move towards death in self-isolation. Well, as it happened, I was scheduled to teach this story in my Canadian Studies Environmental Literature class in March of 2020. And I did. I taught it in one of my first Zoom classes online during the pandemic. And it was terrifying. It was prescient. What had seemed like a speculative apocalyptic vision in the short story suddenly seemed very, very real. P.K. Page published Unless the Eye Catch Fire in 1979 and republished it, still prescient, in 2002. And in 2020, still prescient. Since then, global warming has shifted from speculative fiction, though, to fact. And we are now, I would say, 2/3 of the way through Page's story. You just need to think of the proliferation of catastrophes, and catastrophic weather events that we've seen. Oh, there's a beautiful passage from Page. I'll just leave that up while I say the next bit. You just need to think of the proliferation of catastrophic weather events we've seen in BC alone in the last year. Heat domes, forest fires, atmospheric rivers leading to flooding and landslides. It's not inconceivable that we have to stay inside because the outside is inhospitable or even uninhabitable. So, as I said, Unless the Eye Catch Fire is becoming more realistic by the day. Now, it's widely understood and accepted that we're living in the Anthropocene, the epoch where humans have had direct impact on the environment, where it's recognized that atmospheric, geologic, hydrologic, biospheric, and other Earth systems processes are now altered by humans. Public perception has also changed in recent years, from incredulity to banal recognition to the state we're in today. So all that said, though, sometimes what gets missed in environmental discourse is how many current global crises come out of centuries of historical inequities. So before I go on to talk about art and activism, I want to think for a few minutes about how, as Anishinaabe scholar and writer Leanne Betta Samosake Simpson says, We should be thinking of climate change as part of a much longer series of ecological catastrophes caused by colonialism and accumulation-based society. So we need to think historically about the long relationship between settler colonialism and resource extraction. Settler environmentalism doesn't always reconcile the facts of history with Indigenous epistemology. So I want to just pay attention to some Indigenous writers and artists who have engaged with the environment in various ways. So we can think about Simpson, who has written about the fact that Indigenous peoples have witnessed continual ecosystem and species collapse since the early days of colonial occupation. We can look at the poems in the collection from 2015 called Islands of Decolonial Love, where she reminds us of centuries of environmental care and activism in Indigenous communities. The poem I have up here is marked with a date. It's dated June 21st, 1930. While Simpson wrote this poem, or published it in 2015, the sentiment going back, engaging with the long history of care about the environment is really important to think about here, to really think about how it is with great regret that the animals do not consent to the damage your project will cause. But this isn't just about unsettling history that I'm talking about. It's also about Indigenous land rights and issues in the present. So I want to think here, just bring up briefly, two recent short films by Indigenous directors that come to mind that showcase ecological concerns in the accumulation-based society that Simpson was referring to. So we have Elmaya Tailfeather's film Bloodland, which exposes parallels between the violations of Indigenous bodies and the land through fracking. We have Amanda Strong's film Bitaban, which animates Simpson's story about harvesting maple syrup in urban space that is meant then to reclaim land and the people in that space. So we have two really great examples here of decolonial resistance and reconstruction in artistic formats. So, as we know, people, regions, cultures, and communities are impacted by changes in the environment in vastly different ways. Research on toxic geographies and on environmental racism often consider how marginalized communities are disproportionately affected by changes in climate. So I'm thinking now especially about Ingrid Waldron's work on waste management, waterways, and environmental racism in Nova Scotia. In There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, Waldron says this: in Canada, your postal code determines your health. We know that where you live has bearing on your well-being. Indigenous and Black communities are the ones that tend to be located on hazardous sites. Taking into account environmental racism, inequitable access to healthy land and water, and the legacy of settler colonialism, right, all of which come out of long-standing systems of white supremacy in Canada, I engage in this conversation tonight about the multifaceted nature of climate crisis through a climate justice approach. The editors of the anthology Watch Your Head, Writers Respond to the Climate Crisis, published in 2020, define that like this: a climate justice approach insists that questions of colonization, decolonization, racism, anti-Blackness, and other forms of forcibly maintained social inequalities, exclusions, and persecutions cannot be separated from the question of climate and the planet's eroding natural environment. So we have to think intersectionally, and many scholars are doing just that. But we also have to be mindful, it's my hair, sorry, of how environmentalism has tended to elide histories of human relations with the land, even if we come at it through a human climate justice lens. Sometimes we turn to poetry. Sometimes we turn to poetry. In her 2006 book, long poem, Inventory, Dion Brand asked this, and she said, "What would an inventory of the tumultuous early years of this new century have to account for?" I really appreciate this question. I extend Brand's question to ask, what would an environmental inventory of the current moment look like? So that's what I'm thinking about here tonight. What is an inventory right now? For critic Cheryl, loosely again, inventory traces social, economic, and ecological relations across the planet, while resisting portraying the planet merely as a space for human and hydro dams. Nope, that was Leanne Simpson, but it worked for human habitation. The planet is repeatedly pictured as a living, vulnerable body, complete in itself, and the poem explicitly frames ecological destruction as an ethical imperative. So there's a reciprocal relationship between the inhabitants and their home, and that's what she's talking about in Brand's work. But Brand says this, I have nothing soothing to tell you. That's not my job. My job is to revise and revise this list, this bristling list, hourly. Ongoing scholarship also seems to be revising and revising this bristling list. The climate emergency is a pressing topic in Canadian studies and well beyond. So I want to point to some of the ongoing scholarship happening right now. At this very moment, there are 3 calls for papers or participation and several research groups working on the subjects that I'm talking about here. This is the core of Canadian studies right now, from my lens. I know there are many other things that Canadian studies people talk about too. Yes. Guest editors Stephanie Oliver and Kit Dobson recently announced a special issue of the journal Canada and Beyond with the very catchy title, Everything is Awful, ? Ecology and Affect in Literatures in Canada. They ask, how might literary scholars and writers in Canada respond in meaningful ways to ecological crises? And Max Karpinski and Melanie Dennis Unrau, the guest editors of a forthcoming special issue of our own UBC journal, Canadian Literature, ask, what does an attention to resources and/or extraction animate in our analysis of cultural, literary, and poetic responses to this place, this land on and with which we live? These good questions also echo here tonight. Literary critics are obviously not alone in thinking about the environment. The Banff Centre has a call for application for artists this spring 2020, to attend the Ecologies of Precarious Abundance workshop. Intended for visual artists who work at the intersection of queer life and the ecology, the residency will provide a lens to rethink how we might wish to understand relations with each other and with the other than human world. But there are also research projects happening around Canada now. There's Concordia University's eco-didactic turn in art and design installations for the public realm that that explicitly links imagination with learning and subsequent action. Right? They take witnessing, imagination, and action. People walk by a design, they become witness to the devastating world situation, they step closer, and then they are perhaps motivated to solve them. Another interdisciplinary team is called the Synthetic Collective, and they argue art picks up on the facts, the wicked problem of plastic, and it poses and perhaps challenges us with the now what question. And related, finally, to the Synthetic Collective is a museum for future fossils, an ongoing series of projects and events dedicated to thinking curatorially about the Anthropocene and climate. And I think these are really important kinds of interdisciplinary research teams that are coming together, bringing scientists, chemists, geologists, artists, curators together to think about what each of them can bring to this conversation. So my job, though, is really to say, what do they bring? What does art bring, particularly? When I began this project a few years ago, I hypothesized that the role of environmental art was to pay attention, was to recognize and acknowledge that there were problems, It was to raise public awareness and highlight issues, and hopefully have an impact on attitudes and actions. In the end, it was to warn about consequences of climate change and to act. But over the years, I've added to this. And I think we're beyond awareness raising now, and we need to push further. Writers revise, the world warms, what do we do? Or put another way, what is the role of art and literature in the climate emergency in 2022? Well, it's always multiple. It can unsettle expectations, ask questions, but not necessarily answer them all definitively. Can imagine alternative futures in crisis or not. Can speculate on possibilities, listen to many voices, recognize disparities, tell diverse stories, listen to others, make the audience uncomfortable, and ask, what if? Creative practices matter for reasons well beyond the conventional wisdom that we study art because it creates empathy. Yes, empathy, but also knowledge and imagination, projection, discomfort, fear, horror. And that brings me to part 2. As I said, we're halfway through. What if? Consider Sanaz Mazzinani's 2020 Vancouver Art Gallery off-site exhibition, All That Melts, Notes from the Future Past. It speculates on how things could be. The installation presents one vision of a future history, Vancouver in 2080, a mythological space inhabited by the consequences of its recent past, a story of the earth as told by the culture that produced it. Its goal, the gallery notes, is to prompt viewers to reflect on our troubled present, all in an effort to hopefully elicit a different, more desirable future than the one the globe is currently on track to see. The plants that were chosen for this installation are all ones that currently grow in the Lower Mainland, but they won't survive if or when the planet warms. So the installation is both representational, icebergs float, plants are threatened, and the future looks bleak. But it also asks, what if this is the future? What then? In 2016, Amitav Ghosh, the Indian novelist, published a book called The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, where he asked a simple question. Considering what climate change actually portends for the future of the Earth, it should surely follow that this would be the principal preoccupation of writers the world over. And this, I think, is very far from being the case. But why? Since 2016, as I said, there has been a ballooning of work preoccupied with climate change globally. And this is clearly the case now, I would say, in many corners of Canadian studies. If we look at poetry, criticisms, and collaborations, the environment and discussions of the environment proliferate. Some from individual writers and some from collectives. So we have poets like Stephen Collis, Alice Major, Rita Wong. We have collections like Watch Your Head. We've got critical studies like Greeting the Maple. We've got graphic fiction like Gasoline, Dreams, Waking Up from Petroculture, and on and on. Probably more well-known, though, and more prevalent in popular culture is climate fiction in Canada. All of the novels I have listed here, and I just pulled 8 out of the dozens and dozens of possibilities that I could have put up here, all of these are published in the last decade, and they all begin with a speculative question. What if? What if in the future water were the most valuable commodity on the planet, and Canada was thus a superpower? What if a diary floated from Japan to British Columbia after a tsunami? What if climate change led to civil war in America? What if dreaming became a commodity some would retain and others would kill for? What if changes in weather patterns created climate migrants? What might their stories be? One of the functions of literature broadly is to ask, what if? And to imagine the consequences of actions or inactions. I've argued this before, but I really like it, so I'm going to say it again. What if scenarios can be realistic, but they can also be apocalyptic or dystopic? My theory is that what if is a really powerful place to creatively take an environmental inventory, to draw out the repercussions of mistakes, to work through the consequences of actions, and to imagine different ends. By writing about hypothetical and yet imaginable situations, a creative writer can imagine a story from multiple shifting and potentially conflicting points of view. As stories allow for polyvocality and a plurality of outcomes, they are potent sites to engage debates about tough dilemmas. That's real work. That's the work I see of art right now, and writing in particular. So what if is precisely the place that many works of climate fiction begin? While some end in hope, others are more works of warning that end apocalyptically. Writing a review of Michael Christie's book Greenwood in The Walrus, Damon Tarnopolsky notes that we already have plenty of stories about the apocalypse. Now we need ones that imagine new futures. I think he's actually missing the point about imagining the apocalypse. It is a new future. It's just a terrifying one. And some people's projection of the future, loss of land, displacement, dispossession, disruption of culture and community, is other people's history. My son Simon, who's right there, recently reminded me of something that Métis writer Sherry Dimmoline said in 2018 at the Vancouver Writers' Festival, and I apologize for the poorness of this image. I took it from the audience where I may or may not have supposed to be taking pictures. So, yes. So at the Writers' Festival in 2018, shortly after The Marrow Thieves was published, Simon and I were there, and we were listening to Sherry Dimmoline talking. The novel she was talking about is set in a world that has been virtually destroyed by global warming and where young Indigenous characters are being hunted by truant officers for their bone marrow that holds the ability to dream. At the Writers' Festival, Dimmoline talked about how easily Indigenous people could write apocalyptically because the apocalypse for them had happened. Now, this powerful statement stuck with my then teenage son, and it's really important here. What I see as the power of what if in art and literature is not necessarily a projection for everyone. It's also sometimes an imagined articulation of historical and ongoing change, loss, slow violence, and destruction. In an interview where she discusses her installation, Fountain, which is a film projected behind a sheet of water, Anishinaabe performance poet Rebecca Belmore has famously asked this. She asks, how long do I have to do this? How long do I have to say, look at us and listen to us? This film is shot on Iona Beach in Richmond, right over there. In it, water turns to blood. As one of the critics of this piece has said, as befits our times, we don't know whether this is a metaphor for creation and connectedness or an apocalyptic vision. But perhaps it's most powerful as both, right? The ambivalence, warning, carries possibility. And I think that's the case here. It is a warning, and there is a possibility you can have both, right? That ambiguity, that ambivalence, that is what art can carry. And this brings us to materials. What if does not happen only in storytelling, right? Artists often experiment with materials, asking what if I turn to the land and water for materials? What if I create pigment out of berries, out of blood, or out of mud? How do they speak back? What if I am embedded writing in a place? So by materials here, I'm thinking about words, images, performance, ideas that come across on paper, canvas, all kinds of things. I'm thinking about how Rebecca Belmore here talks about material as concept, and Dennis Lee here talks about his material as words. If the planet is regreenable, he says, words are one place it has to happen. Not as a substitute for action, science, or laws, but as one of the many dimensions in which we have to refashion our dwelling on Earth. And as it happens, this is the one medium which poets inhabit simply by virtue of their calling. I love this. I love thinking about the power of words here and words as material. But I also think about artists who have found materials, artists like Gabrielle Hirondelle-Hill, who found scrap metal, gloves, socks, and gravel, and really thinks about the danger of attitudes rooted in the values of convenience, what happens when you throw things away. I like thinking about artists like Genevieve Robertson, who has a body of drawings that use pigments made out of found carbon-based materials, coal, graphite, ash, wildfire, derived charcoal, that she collected in the East and West Kootenays, and that she responds to the place using those materials. Or, like the image on the right, engaging with the language of the rack zone by using bitumen, by using seawater, by thinking through the materials that come out of that space and seeing what happens with them. And Robertson, again, who collected silt from Columbia River. Rita Wong and Fred Waugh, who created the 2 lines of poetic text that flow along a 114-foot-long map of the Columbia River, who went to the Columbia River and walked many, many, many kilometers along it, listening to the water, listening to the space, and creating poetry out of it. And Jill Ho-Yu, who has a wonderful show in Calgary called Layton Monuments, where she takes petri dishes of bacteria, of things that will survive after climate change, after the world warms, like cancer cells, mosquitoes, ticks, cholera, and the Zika virus, puts them in a petri dish and watches them grow, and they take on new life. And she talks about changes in climate and biodiversity in this way. But the one I want to think most about here is decomp, which is thinking about what nature can grow. This collaboration is fascinating to me. In 2013, poets Stephen Collis and Jordan Scott published this book called Decomp. And it was in many ways, when I was writing a book review of this book for Canadian literature, that I really started thinking through my curiosity about creative and imaginative ways artists are dealing with the environment, and they're dealing with it in a poetic framework. So in 2009, Collis and Scott traveled to 5 distinct British Columbian biogeoclimatic zones categorized under the provincial government's Ministry of Forestry classification system. So they went to these 5 places. Those zones were created, they argue, under a logic of resource extraction. It's a division according to dominant and thus harvestable tree species. So this is a map made by Capital. In each zone, they left a copy of Darwin's Origin of the Species open to the elements. They went back a year later to see what had happened, right? To find these decomposing books, decipher them, and translate the remnants into a series of found poems. So in the collection, the poets reverse the normal flow of bringing nature into the poem by bringing the text into nature, they said. They go a step beyond other ecological poets as they speak with, rather than about, nature, and they draw poetry out of variations of climate and ecosystems. So as the environment writes back, each of the 5 ecosystems reacts distinctly to the cardstock cover, the paper, and the words on it. So biodiversity modifies decomposition. I really like this. It's so cool. That's my academic perspective. So cool. In a CBC radio interview, Collis explains that they began by writing, "What would nature's response be to all the poets' annoying talk and discussion and troping and philosophizing about what nature means?" And as I said, I like this. So to answer the question, that gave the elements the opportunity to overwrite Darwin in ecological variations. This brings me to think about trees. So speaking of resource extraction and harvestable tree species, I want to think about forestry and think about another form of participatory art. So this comes out of logging. Forestry has been the subject of art for decades in Canada. So I can think about Emily Carr's Scorned as Timber, Beloved of the Sky, which has really a clear cut with one tree standing. Lawrence Paul Yaxwell-Upton in the 1990s, playing between clear cut to the last tree and the image of the desecrated ground. Many poets, you can think of Don Mackay and After Chainsaw, Deactivated West. So many different poets have engaged and responded to logging and deforestation as well. But I want to think now about one event. A year ago, in March 2021, the Eden Grove Artist Residence Program brought artists into one of the last stands of old-growth forests on southern Vancouver Island in unceded Pakshat territory. The artist studio was positioned just across from Eden Camp, one of the logging blockades established at the Addicks Ferry Creek area. Apparently, the resident artisans at Eden Grove were immersed in the forest ecosystem while also bearing witness to the front lines of the forest protection movement. So they not only documented what they saw, they also created an important archive of action there. The Fortune Gallery's exhibition, Last Stand, Ancient Forests, Collective Action, so in Victoria last summer, it came out of this residence program, connecting art and activism explicitly. According to the curator, Jessie Demers, participating artists, while advocating for protection of ancient forests, are also using their work to create space, ask questions, and explore the complexity of interconnected issues, from Indigenous rights to climate change. So we have Lonely Doug the first night, we have more Lonely Doug, Big Lonely Doug, and Lonely Doug as on a wooden metronome set to the rate of trees felled in British Columbia, back and forth and back and forth. I haven't seen this exhibit, so I'm really relying on the website documentation about it, but it seems quite striking, absolutely striking. So what we hear here, or what we see here, are echoes of both Ruth Ozeki's notion of interconnectedness and Rita Wong's necessity to act. We've got them together. Another artist who was there was Randy Cook, who took some of the trees that had been, the wood that had been felled, and created art out of it. A Kwakwakwa artist was able to do carving there and carving in place. It's really interesting to think about how, as one of the blockader people said, Eden Camp, it's more than a tactic, more than a blockade. It's an art piece, an installation of determination. So the activists saw their daily acts of resistance as an art form, right? I think if we think about this, as I have said all along, art and criticism take many forms. For the last couple of minutes here, I just want to think about oil. So it's another huge controversial topic in BC, and a lot of scholarly work has been done on petrocultures, led by researchers at the University of Alberta. Thinking about petrofiction, petroart, petrography from within the petrostate, that petrocultures group has done a lot. And I'm indebted to that foundational research here. I want to think about this image, the image of a poetry jam pipeline. So this is another example of exemplary creative collaborative activism. This is from the N pipeline, 70,000 kilometers of poetry written in resistance to the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline's proposal. And it sits at the intersection of poetic expression and civic participation, according to one contributor. The project was launched in 2010 And it was published as a poetry collection in Smithers in 2011. It was conceived when Vancouver poet Christine Leclerc was chained to the door, the head office of Enbridge. And she writes this in the introduction to the collection. While being removed from the premises, the image of a poetry jam pipeline struck me. What if poetry could stop a pipeline? That's what the collection was based on. So to protest the development of the 1,173-kilometer pipeline from Bruderheim, Alberta to Kitimat, BC, Leclerc decided to try and match the pipeline centimeter for kilometer, where Times New Roman 12-point font centimeter equals a kilometer of pipeline. And she tried to match it with words and invited poets from around the world to join her. She formed an editorial collective with a group. They curated a website, and they published the N-Pipe collection. So this showcases a generation of collective artistic activism that's facilitated by internet technology that's made collaboration easier, more accessible, and more powerful as a way to foster dissent. As poet Fred Waugh says, kilometer after kilometer, the N-Pipeline occupies its space by writing in it. So, in a review of the collection, poet Derek Beaulieu puts it this way. The N-Pipeline, poets draw a line in the sand and enact their politics. No longer is the landscape something wistfully elegized, it's the line where poets say no more, not again. Beaulieu picks up where Smith left off in his critique of the wistful nature elegy. This is increasingly politicized line of environmental poetry, and it's moved from feeling the sear of those crocuses of the early 20th century to recognizing the bursting pipelines of the early 21st. As I've said, though, creative activism takes many forms. So we have more art here for a minute. We've got this incredible image of oil that looks like blood. It's reminiscent, very much, I think, of Belmore's fountain. We've got Lawrence Paul Yaxwell-Lupton's Killer Whale has a vision and comes to talk to me about proximological encroachments of civilization in the oceans, which you should not say 3 times fast. Yaxwell-Lupton also has 2 of my favorite titled pieces of all time, Christy Clark and the Kinder Morgan Go-Go Girls, and Fucking Creeps, They're Environmental Terrorists, which really speak for themselves. And Gord Hill, who is a Kwakwakwa artist who depicts Wet'suwet'en resistance to the Coastal GasLink pipeline in northwestern British Columbia. And I have to say, the only place I have found this is on Facebook, on February 15th, 2020. So I haven't been able to actually track down this image, but it just has stayed with me the whole time. Since climate change is by nature disproportionate, it often overwhelms our understanding of scale and impact, Benedict Ramades says. It becomes virtually impossible to visualize, and art is certainly one of the most powerful mediators for changing our vision. I'm so interested in this concept of scale. So the last set of images I want to show you are by Edward Burtynsky, the most well-known Canadian artist, I think, in this sphere of environmental art, and the one who shows up the most often on the global top 10 environmental artists lists. So Edward Burtynsky. He's known for creating these striking aerial images of the environmental impact of oil fields, of mines, of hydroelectric dams, fish farms, terraced agriculture. He's also collaborated on several important and influential films, like Manufactured Landscapes and the Anthropocene, the Human Epoch. In the 2000s, he created a series of images documenting the oil sands industry in Fort McMurray. He said, I began to think about oil itself as both the source of energy that makes everything possible and the source of dread for its ongoing endangerment of our habitat. So how do you capture that ambivalence? Well, Burtynsky tried to do it with aerial photographs, as has Louis Helbig, who's done a series of even more abstracted, more patterned kind of photographs, like this one of bitumen swirls and the bitumen scarecrow, or this Albion pit, also of Fort McKay. Sorry, this time of Fort McKay. And I think, okay, so how do you deal with the challenge of scale, right? These images show it, but they also step back. And I think that there's an issue there, right? This is a problem that I am obviously not alone in thinking about, and several critics have noted. But I do wonder about the problem of aestheticizing the landscape, rendering it as beautiful, and when in doing so, rendering humans as really small, minuscule, distancing the objects under investigation. It becomes what the critic Maurizia Boscaglia says about what she calls waste aesthetics, but she says that is a new type of intransitive aestheticism arises, a one-way image of beauty that precludes critique. You're removed, so you have no responsibility to respond, to act, or to change. Jennifer Peoples goes further to argue that the beauty of such images obfuscates the health and environmental risk of the polluted sites that they photograph. She writes about what she calls the toxic sublime in Burtynsky's work, drawing on historical notions of place, nature as a place of awe, fear, and danger. So earlier tonight, we saw in the painting by Lucius O'Brien a depopulated Saguenay River that rendered colonial expansion through those little boats as an inevitable part of the picturesque landscape. Here, I think, similarly, in the shadow of nature's awesome beauty in the Alberta oil sands, we have the Burtynsky and Helbig photos that render this destruction as fixed, not fixable, right? Awareness raising. But there's really little room for what if here, right? Where's the what if in this image? I could spend all day looking at this image, but it's not going to make me act. I don't know what that really means to act, and that's what I want to think about here, and I've been trying to think about all night. I end finally, I know I threatened to end before, but I really do end this time with Warren Carrio. This is just to say we've burned up all the oil and poisoned the air you were probably hoping to breathe. Forgive us. It was delicious, the way it burned so bright and so fast. It's a rewriting of William Carlos Williams, but I like this one a lot more. Carrio is fascinating. He has gone into the Athabasca River and taken out bitumen from the river. And he has created a process that he's called petrography, which is literally petroleum photography, the creation of images through the interaction of sunlight and heavy petroleum product known as bitumen, he says. So the practice he has figured out is derived using a technique from 1827 from one of the early forms of photographic development. And it's an embodied attempt to use petroleum as a medium of representation, to see the world quite literally, as he says, through a film of heavy crude oil. He too has some images that he took from the air, and these are the Syncrude storage tanks, but he has developed them using bitumen. And so we look at them differently. When you have one of these in front of you and you move it from side to side, the image moves. The light plays differently off of it. So it's not static. It keeps moving. It's not fixed. He also takes images that he took from the ground and uses this petrography method with those. And again, we have the mobility, the movement in the image. And again, here we see the same thing, right? We have a pond reflecting from the ground. So he grounds his images and then he remediates them. He says, I see petrography as an alternate mode of remediation, one that reveals rather than covering up, doesn't purport to remedy anything, but it remediates by diverting a small amount of bitumen out of the commercial realm of the energy industry and repurposing it into a medium of representation, one that continues to remind us of the toxic as well as the pleasurable aspects of our relationship to petroleum. Now, Petrography, I think, reminds us that oil is a natural resource, and it is human activity that renders it destructive. Human activity can also change attitudes. A manifesto needs to make things manifest, Cario says, to open eyes, to unplug ears. I want to close with the words of Antonio Guterres again. At the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow in November, the UN Secretary General gave an ultimatum. We face a stark choice, he said. Either we stop it or it stops us, thinking of climate change. It's time to say enough. Enough of brutalizing biodiversity. Enough of killing ourselves with carbon. So my job this evening has been to think with you about how some artists and writers have creatively said enough, now and in the past, individually and in collectives. In Canada, asking what if and speculating on what if we don't. Please join me for Series 2. Let's talk and ask questions now. Okay. Who's ready for some yoga? Anybody have any questions, or would you just prefer a glass of wine and some cheese, which is also good? Matthew. Yeah.
Sure, I'll start off. Thanks so much for a really thoughtful, provoking, and wide-ranging talk. And Wayne, would you try to sketch out some of the ways with the roles of environmental art and with the focus of environmental art and the discussion of climate emergency? I think it was also a statement about the role of the environmental humanities in the discussion too. But that made me think about the discussion in the summer where there was an attempt to bring together various scholars and researchers from across both campuses to think about intersections around climate and what roles different fields could bring to the discussion. And I would say the two areas that were probably most left out of that discourse were around the humanities, creative performing arts, but also health disciplines. And so I got into reflecting on how there is a common language between the environmental sciences, the engineering, and social sciences, but it is a different discourse, a more sort of solution-oriented discourse. So I'm curious to hear your reflections of how the environmental humanities and artists working in an environmental framework might engage, or how there might be ways to do that.
That's a great question. I'll just rephrase it so the online can hear. Matthew Evenden is asking about the role of basically the environmental humanities and thinking about the way that sometimes in some of the scientific, geographic kinds of conversations that go on, the role of art and the humanities is left out. And at UBC last summer, there was a discussion about climate change and the role of research at UBC and what we could do. And absolutely, the environmental humanities were left out. That was not unnoticed by many people in the field. So I do smile at your recognition of that. I think it can give a lot. I think it's really important. And that's why I actually think that it's useful to look at models like the Synthetic Collective, that is a mixture of geologists, scientists, curators, artists, people who work together to think about what part of the big picture they can look at differently. So when I think about things like polyvocality, many voices, hearing many voices, or looking at speculation and imagination, I think those are incredibly powerful and undervalued elements of what the arts bring, right? We can look at a series of graphs and data, but how do you animate those numbers? How do you talk about individual stories or individual impact? You can do it poetically, you can do it in a story, you can do it in narrative form, you can do it in a larger image or a small, more focused one. But I think it goes beyond the awareness raising, as I was saying, right? And I don't think it's just supplemental. I don't think it's, here's the images, how do we animate them? What's the best infographic? Let's ask a storyteller. I think there's actually more that they can give. And I think what it is really thinking about that impact of speculation, the impact of what if, that I really like going back to, thinking about what if we do this? What's the path we can take, right? It's systems thinking in a way. What if we do this? Where does our story go? Here's a problem. How do we fix it? Right? That's a story, right? Conflict, denouement, resolution. We do that. We're trained to do that as literary people. So what are the stories out there? Who are the actors? Who are the characters? What are the main themes? What are the main issues at stake? How do we take that further? I think there's a lot of really valuable work and a lot of really valuable skills that people in the environmental humanities can bring to the table. They can also think historically, right? I get frustrated at how often people think that they're asking a question for the first time, and I can go back 20 years, and then I can go back 50 years before, and 100 years, and that's the problem of being a historian. You can keep going back and finding the problems and being articulated. So I think knowing about what's happened in various places and at various times is a way of helping those kinds of conversations. And acknowledging and recognizing that words mean something different in different contexts, disciplinary contexts, is absolutely key to those conversations, to helping them move forward. John?
Well, thank you very much. I was really struck by the petrol photography, which I had seen before. But it made me realize just how, in the context of what you're talking about, how material photography is as a medium, both in terms of the lenses that get used, and in the developing processes, often which are highly toxic. So the daguerreotypes, the first commercial photography, was full of arsenic and toxins that killed many people. Right here so this almost could be a subcategory.
Absolutely.
Karen Zalamea, who you may not know,
I don't.
Here at UBC, got a grant to make lenses out of ice. And go to Iceland and photograph the weather. But of course, the lens is melted.
Yeah.
And it's a very powerful series that you've done, and there's a book. And I do think they're profoundly material and profoundly germane to what we're talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So John O'Brien's just pointing out the toxicity of photography and photographic processing and the history of that. One of the things that I think is really powerful when you look at Warren Carrio's work and his website on petrography is to look at the images of him and his assistants wearing gas masks and thinking about the process that he had to go through to render bitumen into a photograph. The process is I'm a little bit sketchy on what the actual process was, but it is intense use of many chemicals that had to dissipate over time. So he had to build a structure in his backyard. He had to build fans, right? So the concept of remediating bitumen to show this natural product, nature is toxic sometimes, right? It's not just humanity. I was talking to Patsy Badir earlier about rivers on the way over here. We were talking about rivers and the fact that a river can be beautiful, but it can also be deadly, right? Nature is sometimes deadly. It's sometimes toxic. The process is to turn it into art or to recognize it, to see it differently, can sometimes be dangerous as well. But that, the example of turning ice into a lens is fascinating, and I will follow up on that. Yeah, thank you. Anyone? Are there any online or? Okay. Anyone here? Cheryl.
I was just thinking, as you were talking, about an exhibition I saw in an art museum in Brisbane about 5 years ago, and now she expressed what concrete, as it were, action comes out of humanity's environmentalism. I forgot the name of the artist, but I will send it to you. But we walked into this wonderful modern gallery, and facing us was this 3-level massive exhibition of plastics that had been gathered up on the shores of Portugal and were distributed with fishing boats and other obviously human things that would be used to bring us food, etc. And there was Jean, my husband, who studied that sort of thing. And so it was no mystery to him, and he could explain it scientifically. But the artistic impact of being surrounded on 3 levels by such a massive installation piece was unforgettable to my young grandson and to our own kids. That's how art moves us. That's how it acts. And that was not a static experience. It was an immersive experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I know that exhibition. It's a really powerful one. I did a section of this project is actually on plastics and on plastic found in the ocean. So I've presented my work on that in other places that I'm happy to share with you. And so that is one case. There are many instances of people taking art that they have found and repurposing them into new forms, right, to show scale. Right? Timothy Morton calls it hyper objects, to show the scale, right? Scalar aesthetics is what Imre Seaman calls it. But there are various ways of trying to get to the notion of scale. How do you show scale, right? Which is the thing I was just touching on at the end there. But that exhibition in Portugal, I think, did it a little bit better than some that I saw, because the write-up that goes with it, and I'm afraid I can't remember the artist who did it as well, but the write-up that goes with it is so absolutely, almost forensically detailed about where every piece of plastic came from, not where it was found, but where it originated. And it has that whole story of the travel of the plastic to get to there. So it doesn't just stop with entering the room and being overwhelmed by that. To me, the material on the sides around it, framing it, were also so powerful. In my other work, I've compared that to Douglas Copeland's Vortex, which was an exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery, where he took many tons of plastic found on the beaches in Haida Gwaii and filled a pool in the Vancouver Art Gallery, one of the galleries. A lot of the material came from the tsunami in Japan in 2011. And 2 things that Copeland put into his exhibition, into his art piece, were found boats that had washed up. And he put them there. And I really struggled with looking at that, because they have names, they have titles. And he took them and repurposed them to make a point about the environment, instead of giving them back to their owners. But also, like, thinking about, like, what... It drew attention to plastics in the ocean, and doing it at the Vancouver Aquarium was really valuable. But for Copeland, he centered himself in the narrative. And it wasn't all... It was about him finding it, as opposed to really, even though it was articulated as a response to the tsunami, it wasn't about the travels of the pieces there. So there was quite a distinction between the one in Portugal you're talking about and the one in Vancouver that I saw. Mark.
Just following up on Matthew's point about, as it were, the role of the environmental humanities in relation to other environmental discourses and disciplines and so forth. I can see the drive that we all feel to coordinate and organize and be as inter- and transdisciplinarily effective as we possibly can in our institutions. At the same time, I'm very struck by the way you presented yourself this evening explicitly several times over as doing a very disciplinarily specific kind of work. You call yourself a literary critic. And I'm reminded that when academic literary criticism first really got serious about itself, in order to have a mandate for English departments, for example, it was, and this is about 100 years ago, almost to the day, the moment of the wasteland. The first, and perhaps still one of the most brilliant theorists of what might have been criticism for the modern age, an age in which, as he said, nature had been neutralized by science was that it configured individual human beings' impulses in a way that got them to a point of being ready to do something. And he never explained what it was he expected any of these people to do. And I think that was not what he should be doing. He was explaining how certain acts of critical attention, which could be taught and modeled and disseminated to, well, if not the whole population, then to a significant cadre in the population, would enable citizens to be ready for action. And the fact that he was a mountaineer in the other part of his life, and one could sort of feel the conditioning going on here, as if, you know, if you're going to be a successful mountaineer, you've got to be in a certain state of physical, psychological readiness. Because you're a mountaineer, you know exactly what you're going to do in that conditioning. But you should be poised in your talk saying, I'm still thinking about this problem of what to do next. I actually don't think it's the role of literary critics or even necessarily the environmental humanities to take on the job that the engineers or the policymakers or the health professionals are doing. I think maybe you have shown again, art critics might not agree with this, but if literary criticism or art criticism, say, has something useful still to do in the university, in society, it's precisely to get to this point of readiness in the cases of as many individuals as possible. And if the fact that you and Cheryl both mentioned the effects on your kids of artistic experiences, we are all, some part of our lives, teaching younger people and trying to remember what it is that makes that worthwhile. Just an object lesson in that. And the interdisciplinary part of me actually leaves the room at this point, so I can applaud you for being strictly what you set out to be in your career, which is a literary critic. I wonder if we have enough of them left on the planet.
Oh, I think we do. I really think we do. Okay, I'm not going to paraphrase what Mark Vesey just said. But I will respond by saying, yes, I'm a literary critic and a proud one, but I also do think that interdisciplinary conversations are important to bring different perspectives and points of view and knowledge to the table, right? We're all knowledge makers and knowledge keepers and trying to move conversations forward. I do like how you saved me for ending without action and asking a question and said that's good because that's what we do. It is true, we do. We ask questions, right? My job is incredulity to master narratives, right? I'm a post-structuralist. But I think that I don't want to just end there with just asking questions. I think there's more. And I think there is more in speculation and imagination and really thinking about projection and being able to consider what else is out there. And I do stand as a literary scholar who has looked at some images and pictures and felt things and wanted to try and bring them into conversation. Thank you for that. I think we've reached a point this evening where it would be wonderful for us to go and have a glass of water or juice or wine or cheese or a plate of cheese and not a glass of cheese. Just to head over there, really. So I say thank you and see you on the 17th.